Hello, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us for diversity and inclusion, not something that is going to fix itself. While we're waiting for folks to come on in, please take a moment and say hello in the chat box and let us know from where you hail. We'd love to hear from you. Welcome. Saying hello to folks as they come in. Again, take a moment, say hello in the chat box. Let us know where you call home. Also, I'd like to know why you joined us today. What questions do you have about diversity and equity and inclusion in the workplace? How can we support you in best practices in your organization or any of your related D&I initiatives? And let us know exactly how to make this meaningful for you in your company and in your role. So I think it's really important that you tell us how to make this and our time together matter and meaningful for you. So we're going to go ahead and jump on in. So welcome to Lean DEI's presentation on diversity and inclusion. It's not something that's going to fix itself. Little bit of background on Lean DEI. Lean DEI combines next-gen artificial intelligence with high-touch people development to deliver what we call a right-sized solution at the right time and the right budget for building an inclusive culture. So a little bit about us and our management team. My name is Anissa Avon, and our management team includes Shweta Pai and Vivek Mehta. In a moment, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. But first, allow me to share a little bit about me and why I'm so crazy passionate about diversity and inclusion, as well as Lean DEI and the framework that we're going to share with you today. So my name is Anissa Avon, and I am the founder and CEO of Turnkey Coaching and Development Solutions. Turnkey is an enterprise coaching, training, and management consulting firm, and we provide outsourced learning and development solutions through a single point of contact. With more than 1,000 coaches and trainers and strategic planning experts in the US and key hubs globally, I'm really proud to say that our team has some deep experience in this space. But far beyond the synergies and professional reasons that I'm passionate about the topic of D&I, I have some deeply personal motivation for our mission of helping companies to foster a culture of respect and improve their diversity and inclusion and ultimately the equity in their organization. So you see, I was raised in a wonderful family, loving and kind and racist. And to this day, I have people in my life that I care deeply for who don't realize that they continue to hold biases that perpetuate inequality and unfairness. And in many cases, I consider that to be complicit in the mistreatment of people of color and those in the LGBTQA community, as well as other marginalized groups. So I personally believe that this work is the most important work that I've ever undertaken. I also believe that the fastest way to change a culture is to work with organizations that believe in diversity and inclusion. So without further delay, I am very excited to introduce you to our team. So Shweta, will you get started and tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Anissa. Hi, everyone. I'm Shweta Pai. As Anissa mentioned, I have a company, Organalytics. Organalytics looks to measure inclusion within companies, and we'll go more into my technology a little bit later as we get into this and how we really use that to help companies measure and benchmark and really look at inclusion within their teams. But my background is really in finance in very large companies. I have seen diversity and inclusion programs really across a lot of different industries, a lot of different investment banks and other multinational global companies. And I've, as someone, as an employee, as a leader, as a manager, I've seen where they succeed, but also the big places where they don't succeed, where there are gaps. So that's what drove me to create Organalytics as a D&I tech company. And then that's exactly what makes me really excited about this partnership and Lean DEI, our solution, because we can have an impact in exactly those areas where we saw gaps when I was in a lot of these large companies. So that's a little bit about me. I'll turn it over to Vivek to talk about him and his background.
Thanks, Swetha. Hi, I'm Vivek. I'm the CEO of Weave. Weave is an employee experience platform. We really focus on helping people leaders to build happy and high-performing teams. In my previous life, I was a consultant for Fortune 100 companies. My job was kind of bouncing around from different industries, different companies at different sizes. And I started to see a trend, which was this growing disconnect between employees and leaders. This is for a multitude of reasons. There are faster paces of work, changing technologies, most recently, the huge shift to remote work. But the question became, how do we build strong employee-leader relationships no matter where we're at? At Weave, we use AI and natural language processing to solve that question. We're going to dive a little bit more into what that means later in the presentation. And that aspect of what we do is really what ties together the whole framework that you're about to hear about.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, one of the things that I think is important is that we share a little bit about our backgrounds, but also so that you know that some of the practices and philosophies that we're going to share with you and ideas come from that place I mentioned earlier of deep experience. So while Lean DEI was founded in 2020 out of a great passion to respond with our Vivek and Shweta and myself, our technologies and our services, collectively, we've got a lot of experience working with organizations of all shapes and sizes, a few of which you probably recognize here from their logos. But I want to start with our agenda. And while we're going to share with you Lean DEI's framework, I think what I want to make sure is clear is this is about taking the framework of identify, engage, and solve, and using that to create your own strategic roadmap. But before you can do that, I think it's really important that we talk a little bit about the DEI landscape. And when I use DEI, I am meaning diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some companies refer to that as just D&I for diversity and inclusion, whatever your acronym is. We're going to also talk about the elephant in the room, and that's this resistance that has probably always been around, but now it's right to the surface. And companies last year, as well as large government agencies, canceled all D&I, all unconscious bias, et cetera, as a knee-jerk reaction to just the state of social injustice in our culture at large. So we're going to talk about that elephant in the room, and if you're in charge of D&I, what do you do about that? We're also going to talk about why it's important, more than any other culture shift initiative or learning and development initiative, that you create a right size solution for your organization. If any of you have ever heard the stories of someone very eager to implement let's go to the extreme, a pay equity program, right? How quickly you'll get shut down. Well, the same goes for unconscious bias or any other D&I initiative project you may want to undertake. It's important that you do the right size solution just for you. So that means you're going to identify the connections and the opportunities, gaps, we'll call them in the OD space, right, of your culture versus where you want to go. You're going to want to engage your employees. We're going to talk a little bit about crowdsourcing and getting that feedback from all employees of all backgrounds in order to incorporate whatever is important to them, whatever they're sensitive about, into your programs. And then we're going to look to solve for inclusion, and that's through coaching and training and education and mentoring. And well, we'll get to it. So Vivek, will you talk to us about the social disruption piece?
Sure. We all know it. The social disruption is happening. The world is changing. Our choices are to try and chase after that change and try to keep up. We can get run over by it, or we can actually drive the change. At this point, everyone knows the stats. Inclusive organizations are more innovative. They have greater returns, lower turnover. They capture more market share. But we still see companies repeatedly falter. In about 5 minutes of Googling, we're able to pull up headlines on issues in Silicon Valley on racism, age discrimination. We see issues with a lack of women in the C-suite. A very famous example is Starbucks. In 2018, there was a manager who called the police on 2 Black men who were just sitting in the shop. They were arrested within 10 minutes of them sitting there. In response, Starbucks actually did the right thing. They closed all 8,000 stores to do trainings. But now you fast forward to 2020, 2021, and they're coming back in the news for things like banning employees for wearing BLM attire. The lesson that we see here is large corporations are often taking these issues very seriously. They're pouring really impressive resources in, but they're being reactive. They're only acting on symptoms of the issue rather than trying to make deeper change within their organizations. So if we know that companies understand the importance and the value of being inclusive and the great costs of not being so, what is the gap? What are organizations missing right now? And I'll pass it over to Shweta for this one.
So as we mentioned, we've seen D&I programs across a lot of different companies. And here's what we've seen most of the time. It's often knee-jerk reactions like what Anissa was mentioning. They are programs that also tend to be very top-down and centralized. There's a corporate diversity office that manages a lot of these programs, and that's kind of where a lot of that accountability goes to at the top. But because of how top-down and centralized it is, by definition, it's also very broad and generic. And what it also does is, and I can speak to this personally, is for the operational leaders who are actually out there managing teams, there tends to be very little support for the operational leaders. And moreover, because of that, there doesn't seem to be much of a ROI that it gets measured or even people held accountable. It's just kind of a population metric or a demographic metric, but there isn't something around inclusion or how do you actually measure that cultural change. And because of all of these, what we see is that there tends to be no long-term impact. I mean, we've all seen this. How many years has it been that we've had diversity programs? More than 30. I've been in the workforce for almost 20 years. I've seen it every single time. I've seen every single year. So it's been there for more than 30 years, but the needle has barely moved in any of these metrics. So that's what we tend to see is no long-term impact. But what we've also found is that not all discrimination is obvious. So that's another big aspect, is that because it's not obvious, because you can't just pinpoint and say, here is exactly what the problem is, a generic solution also doesn't tend to be effective. That famous saying by Leo Tolstoy, it's every happy family is the same, every unhappy family is unhappy for its own reasons. That's exactly, I'm totally murdering that quote, but that is the case in a lot of companies as well. Not all, and that happens. That's why not all solutions are effective either. And that's where we get to what can we do? What do we see with programs? And I'll turn it over to Anissa.
You bet. So, I think what you said about not all discrimination is obvious, it runs that gamut of what is overly sensitive to one person is absolute pure discrimination to another. And so what does this mean for our programs? Well, here's what we know, right? We know that training around unconscious biases or microaggressions or sensitivity can be divisive, even if it's not overtly discussed as divisive. Folks are at the water cooler saying, we got to do that again. Why can't people just be less sensitive, right? We know that coaching works. It's really powerful at change management, but it can be expensive and unpredictable, right? We know that awareness alone fails to inspire diversity appreciation, right? Being aware that we should have a diverse and inclusive culture is not enough to inspire the culture shift that has to happen. We also know that at times diversity policies, when, for example, there's a leadership staff communication gap, and up here the leaders are, for example, and this, out of efficiency, we do this, we'll brainstorm, hey, we've got a great idea, why don't we do this? And then they implement it and everyone is blindsided because they didn't see it coming. Why did we change our PTO policies? What's this all, right? So it has to be done carefully in order to not create further disruption. So we're at a tipping point, right? And Vivek, will you switch? There we go. We're at a tipping point. Systemic racism plus structural discrimination plus implicit bias, even those of us who've been through many unconscious bias trainings still have moments of, oh my gosh, what an idiot I was, right? Plus call out culture in many ways is creating this ground force, this groundswell for change, and yet it doesn't always do it in such a way to minimize resistance and create buy-in. So when you combine all of that, and you've got a D&I head who's in charge of creating an inclusive culture, you get organizational crisis. And if it's not done correctly, a lot of the money gets just flushed down the toilet and doesn't do, all of the investment doesn't do what you really need it to do. So how do you extinguish this fuse of resistance? How do you put it out? It's there, right? So what I'm about to share is a little bit controversial. And it's unfortunate that this is kind of where we are, because it would be much better if we could just say, hey, there's a systemic racism and there is massive discrimination and unconscious bias, and we just need to be done with that, right? Just look at the historical injustices and let's acknowledge that if we don't change, we're going to continue to have a hate-filled society and unhealthy workspace, right? But we're just not there. So what does that mean? That means that the companies who are good and really effective at changing the culture, they acknowledge that there is an appropriate dose of historical injustices. There's an appropriate amount of clarity around the benefits of equality for all. And that looks like listening. It looks like fostering an ongoing dialogue. It looks like crowdsourcing with your employees. Where are your needs? How are we serving you? What needs to shift? Have we responded carefully and thoughtfully to your feedback, right? It looks like training your leaders, your managers, and your frontline supervisors on what the behaviors of inclusion look like versus exclusion. It looks like creating a safe place for education and growth and dialogue and productive conflict, giving people the ability to speak frankly about areas in which they are sensitive, in conversations that are in fact discriminatory that people just don't know, creating a safe place where people can set their boundaries and feel included. So you want to support your organization in understanding the value of diversity So I'm going to back up for a second and talk like an entrepreneur and a CEO. Anytime we're going to spend money, we're going to need to know the ROI, because without understanding how this impacts the bottom line financially, you're going to get shortchanged on the budget that you need. It's not personal. It's not a threat against DEI as a worthwhile cause. It just is the way it is. Now, fortunately, there's a lot of business case. There's a lot of positive metrics and a lot of really great research that shows that a diverse culture is more innovative, that you're going to be more attractive to employers, et cetera. So you're going to want to put that in your arsenal and in your back pocket and create an ongoing dialogue about the business case, why it makes financial sense to create a diverse, inclusive, equitable, anti-racist organization. Finally, you want to shift from, yes, you're going to need to talk with employees about historical injustices in order to bring them along about how to become more sensitive. But you're also going to want to talk about the progress made. Here's where we are, but look, here's where we still need to go. And when you can incorporate that, not in a once and done training, not in a let's hire an anti-racism coach to work with this one manager and then move along, or not in a one-time sexual harassment program, now you can create culture change. And that brings us to the elephant in the room, right? So a dominant focus on historical injustices, even though historical injustices have to be a part of your program. When it's imbalanced, what happens is majority groups just automatically feel that their social identity is being threatened. And it causes them internally, even if they're not conscious of the reaction, to resist, deny, and withdraw support for your DEI goals. And at that point, your minority groups feel exhausted. They feel like there's other companies out there that are going to be better at this, that I don't have to feel like it's an uphill climb for people to just understand what my boundaries are. So you're going to have a losing battle. So that's where that minimum effective dose, which in a moment Vivek and Shweta are going to share with us, come in. And that's where the concept around Lean DEI really took hold. So Lean DEI is an end-to-end solution that builds an inclusive workplace. It enables diverse hiring and team building and decision making at all levels of an organization, but it uses a framework that allows it to be done in such a way as to where we take into account change management and an agile, right-sized approach. So let's talk a little bit about how it works. It's about continuous cultural transformation. And if I haven't said that enough, I want to keep saying it over and over again. It's about bite-sized, continuous cultural transformation. And the framework that I really want you to take away from here is iterative, right? And so you're going to look to identify with our methodology and Shweta's expertise. We use organizational network analysis to identify unconscious biases, the employees who are impacted, and the key people leaders, or even just those who have the social connections and the passion for this topic to make a difference. The second is to engage. It's a two-way dialogue with your employees. Within our methodology, Kim, and through Vivek's technology and expertise with our empathetic AI chatbot, Kim is an always available resource for employees to voice their needs in a confidential way, and then we are able to escalate those conversations confidentially or with the employee's permission, their name when appropriate, to people leaders who can take action more assertively and in a timely manner. Finally, the third piece of the framework is to solve. So what does that mean, right? It might mean training. It might mean coaching. It might mean micro consulting or mentoring, but it's about having access to expert D&I consultants for education, training, people development, enabling your managers, your leaders, your executives to make the right decision and take the right action at the right time. So that's the three pieces of the framework that we want you to take away. Whether our methodology and our technology works or not isn't what's important. It's about, you're going to constantly be identifying who's at risk and how do we close the gap, engaging employees, that two-way dialogue, and then finally using micro consulting methodology to address just the current need at the right time, to where in 18 months, 2 years, you've literally been able to shift the culture, and now you have achieved more of the goals with less resistance. So Shweta, tell us about how to identify.
Yeah, thanks. So organizational network analysis, like Anissa mentioned, is something that has been around for a while. And at a very basic level, what it does is it helps us understand the underpinnings of organization. Now, typically we look at an organization as a picture on the left, right? Your typical org chart, that's very common, but we all know as managers and employees that that's not how companies really work. That's not how teams really work. They're complex relationships that really drive how people are working together and collaborating. That's really what drives the organization. And the interesting part is it's often these relationships that help the organization flex when it's under pressure, such as when it has cultural pressure with things like social injustice and inclusion and diversity and just ideas coming in, change happening, dynamic environment. So it's these relationships that help it flex. So what, at a very basic level, what organizational network analysis does is it gives companies and managers a visibility into exactly this. But and we do it very, very easily and very quickly. It's we gather the relationship data through typically a 6 to 7 question survey. It's just a who does what for you kind of question that generates these network maps that you see on the right hand side. Now, these network maps not only show us that new way of looking at the organization, but then it starts to drive up exactly who those key people are. Like we've highlighted down below, we can see who the key people are, and we can also see who's on the outside. And that allows us, then we have machine learning models that do that assisted diagnostics so that you don't have to even learn how network analytics really work. We'll do the hard work for you. The key things that we identify are at-risk employees, so the people who are kind of on that on the outside. We'll identify silos, like what you see on the left-hand side. This is just a screenshot of how when we're doing an analysis, what it kind of looks like. So the organization on the left has two key groups that don't really socialize or talk to each other. We can see that. We can see those silos. And then we can also see who are the key people within those silos that we can actually then leverage to combine this organization, to bust these silos, if you will. So if we're going to connect, we'll connect that circle is a person who's very influential because of the size of the circle. We can actually say, okay, that's who we will leverage to actually break up that silo. So those are kind of some of the big things that we can do with this organization. We can also overlay a lot of your HRIS data so that we can say, okay, how many your demo data, your demographic data, or functional data, so that we can say, oh, all the women are on the outside of your mentorship network. Or perhaps it's minority groups who are self-clustering into or clustering together into small silos. So we can see all of that data when we combine that with our machine learning and provide that report that helps you identify at risk and who are the key people who can actually help us. So that's really for us the first step. We are looking at employees to understand who's most impacted by these D&I issues that may be kind of at the bottom of, or are flowing within your team. We can also identify those biases. So, is it the women who are on the periphery, et cetera? And then we can also see who are the key people who are already positioned that we can leverage to then drive change. So that's really what the first step is to identify these three things. Then we turn it over to the next step, which is now we know whom to engage and how. So let me turn that over to Vivek.
Hey, Vivek, before you get started, let me just mention something about the identify stage. The network analysis is really great when it's, especially for enterprises and large organizations. But if we dial that back and you're a smaller organization, you still want to survey and assess and find out from the employees, right? And so we use the term network analysis, but it's also really important to just a climate scan. I think, Shweta, is the language you often use.
Yeah.
And assess.
You're right.
And there's ways to do that without overtly saying, "So, have you ever been discriminated against?" Right? So, consultant employment law specialist that is also a D&I practitioner, but you want to know whether you're a company of 10 or 200,000, you want to know what their experiences are, and you can't get that through subjective means. And that's where the network analysis or an assessment in the identify stage comes in.
That's a great point, Anissa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, that actually sets me up pretty well. So now that we kind of know at a high level, what are the biases that employees are facing, which groups are most impacted, and which people leaders are positioned to kind of drive change for those groups, now we have to engage with them. And engagement really means conversation, understanding the specific issues and needs and on the ground reality of your workforce. But how do we have those conversations on demand, at scale, with distributed and remote workforces? It's easy to envision how we can have these conversations when we're sitting down one-on-one with small teams in a single room. But the question is, how do we scale it? And that's where I want you to meet Kim. Kim is an always available chatbot that has organic conversation with employees to understand their issues and needs. She lives on your messaging channel, like a Microsoft Teams or Slack, email, SMS. And she creates this very interesting space with a combination of empathy and anonymity, which allows people to be very candid in their feedback. And that's because they feel that they're not being judged, that they're able to talk transparently and with confidence. We see an employee here who likes that he's able to talk to Kim because he feels comfortable sharing some issues there that he didn't feel comfortable sharing with leadership. Now, there's two ways that employees interact with Kim. And whether or not you're using Lean DEI technology, we recommend that these are two communication pipelines that you have set up for your employees. The first is being always available as a resource for anytime employees want to escalate a need or make an issue be heard. There is a clear process in order to do that. The second, and which is more common in Lean DEI, is proactively reaching out to employees in order to understand their thoughts on particular topic areas. Now, we support many key DEI use cases out of the box, things like decision-making influence, trust and belonging, supporting change management. Now, for those of you that are in small organizations, we recommend that these are some of the topics that you're having conversations about. For those of you at large organizations, Kim can help you have these conversations at scale. But the real question becomes, how do we know which conversations to have? What specific topic areas are we discussing, and with who? And that's where the identify stage comes in. Through your network analysis or through your other assessments, you know which employees are facing what kinds of issues and where you need to be diving in deeper. For example, I may have found from a network analysis that my Black engineers are on the periphery. They're not connected to key and influential decision makers in the organization or strong mentors. Kim can engage with those employees, understand their on-the-ground reality, what their immediate needs are, and how can we start to take steps in order to address those issues. So to preface, these are not reactive conversations. We're not overtly asking, hey, are you facing discrimination? Instead, what we're doing is focusing on the underlying issues and focusing on resolving those issues before they escalate into very public incidents. So I want to show you what an example of that looks like. So let's take the example that I just brought up. We have engineers who are on the periphery. They're not really connected to key decision makers. They don't have strong access to mentoring networks. In this case, Kim is reaching out to me as an employee, as an engineer of that organization, in order to understand my thoughts. Now, we're not coming in and explicitly talking about those topics in kind of a very aggressive way. Instead, this is a kind of general check-in on my project that ended last week. So when I'm ready, I can jump into this kind of conversation. And the first thing Kim wants to know from me is, do I feel like it influenced over the decisions that were made during the project? So I'm going to say, not really. I felt like a lot of my ideas were ignored. My spelling mistakes and whatnot, I get kind of cleaned up in the back end. Kim's also using a couple kinds of natural language processing to know what the right follow-up question to ask is. So in this case, Kim wants to know, is this a trend that I'm seeing at my organization? So I'm going to say, yeah, I feel like some of us constantly have to prove ourselves and some have it easy all the time. Now, the other thing that Kim is doing in the background is running some emotional analysis and sentiment understanding so that she's able to empathize with me that this sounds like something that's frustrating. Let me know that's an area that the organization is focusing on improving and that my thoughts are going to be heard, that she's going to pass it along to the right people. And the last thing she wants to know is, did my project manager show an interest in my career progression? So I'm going to say kinda, but it's not really available very often. Now, one very important thing that Kim is able to do is take advantage of the existing resources, programs, and initiatives that you have within your organization. What we see at a lot of companies is they spend tons of money on creating great resources for their employees, and no one knows about them. Or people don't know about them at the right time, and so they don't think to use that resource. In this case, we found out that there's an employee who may not have access to the right mentorship network, and we can direct them to the mentoring program that exists within that organization already. Now, this is the end of a typical conversation, usually takes less than 3 minutes of an employee's time. So it's very non-intrusive throughout their day. Now, Kim wants to know if there's anything else I want to share. The last thing I want to show you is what to do when we encounter topics that shouldn't be handled by a chatbot. So things like harassment, bullying, issues that you would want a human to be able to handle. Those are things that we're going to directly flag for, and we're able to escalate to the right person immediately at that point. Now in this case, I'm going to choose to remain anonymous, but if I wanted to, I could share all my contact information so that someone could specifically reach out to me. And that kind of ends my conversation here. If you have any questions on how the chatbot works or curiosity about anything regarding this technology, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to it at the end. Now, an important point I want to make is, so at the end of these conversations, we're aggregating a lot of great data in terms of emotional insights, topic analysis, sentiment analysis. That's going to let you kind of create clear next steps. But the important thing to remember, no matter what kind of data collection process or technology you're using, analytics themselves don't equate to improvement. If we just dump data on already busy leaders, we're ultimately just going to be counterproductive. What we need to be doing is creating very clear pathway towards improvement. And that path starts with having conversations with the employees to understand their issues. Then broadcasting to say, hey, we heard you, and this is what we're going to do about it, making sure that the process is two-way and not a one-way black box. Then kick off action planning. If you don't know what actions to take, utilize your employees, engage employees in the solution building process, crowdsourcing suggestions for improvement that you already know are going to be popular. And finally, this is not a one and done process. It is a continuous and ongoing engagement to ensure that the needle is incrementally but constantly moving. Now, this is a process that Kim drives from end to end for Lean DEI. But whether you use our tool or not, we recommend that you follow these principles. At the end of the day, you're trying to create a process where employees should feel that if they engage, their processes, their issues are going to be resolved in a timely manner using this process. And as a leader, they should feel that they always know what action to take next. There's never a question of how to move from identification of an employee's need into resolution of an issue. Now, what this means is that we have talked to employees who are impacted about the biases and issues that they're facing, and we're delivering those insights to the people leaders that are positioned to make change. Now that we've kind of set this process up, how do we ensure that those people leaders are going to be successful, that they're going to make the right decisions, and they're going to be able to take the right actions? Yeah, so I'll pass it over to Anissa.
Thank you on that. So now it's about solving, right? So we've identified what are the issues, where are the gaps, who are those that are most likely impacted from being excluded, right? Second, now we've engaged them, we've crowdsourced them, we've provided means for safe and confidential feedback or for them to escalate to leaders. Now it's about solving. And it's important that your managers know how to solve. Well, the challenge is there's a lot of different resources that companies are initiating, but it doesn't mean that all of those resources are the right resource, right? So let's look at a comprehensive DEI program and what those elements are. So you want to be able to, on an annual basis, come back to at least these 10 areas, right? So first, find a way to develop a mentoring program that includes your diverse cultures. Really important. And just because you develop a mentoring program doesn't mean your folks of various identities actually feel that they have access to it. So you're going to want to make sure that that communication is strong, often, and inclusive, of course. So then you want to look at, what are your diversity-focused recruiting plans? Are you reaching out to historically Black universities? Are you ensuring that your recruiting plan has the metrics that are aligned with what, community representation, right? You want to look at facilitating awareness and buy-in via the training. And so that might be implicit bias. It might be anti-racism. It might be white allyship. It might be microaggressions. It's really important in the first two steps to identify where are our gaps and how do we do just the right training to address where our team really is. You want to look at and fine tune your discrimination and your harassment policies. You want to inspect and improve your complaint systems. Most companies say, absolutely, we've got an open door. We always tell people we want to hear their feedback, but the manner in which those complaint systems are set up predict whether or not anyone trusts the process enough to actually give you the information you need. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir on that one. So you want to foster diversified business networks and cross-company networking, establishing employee resource groups. Now, having said that, it's not enough to establish a really great ERG program. You've got to have leadership and your champions who are encouraging your traditionally marginalized groups to participate. to contribute, to get their needs met inside those ERGs. If you're here, you probably already know that having your champions is really important. So making sure you've got a diversity and inclusivity manager / managers is important. Making sure that you're creating a safe place for conversations around race and diversity. One of the things that if working with technology isn't a good fit for your organization, have a listening tour. Have your D&I manager go around and simply have those conversations that Vivek mentioned earlier, creating a safe place. If your culture doesn't trust enough that these conversations are confidential, then hire an expert to come in and do what we call a verbal 360, a climate scan through interviews, or what a recent friend called was, a listening tour. Just want to hear what's going on the ground. But that's how you create a safe space for conversations about race and diversity. First listening, and then creating the space through facilitated processes for people to talk about social discord and unrest, for example. So inspiring culture change is a top-down support. It must be supported top-down. It's one thing for an organization to say, absolutely, our corporate social responsibility policy includes a focus on equity. It's a whole other thing to actually make that happen. But for real culture change, you've got to have your leaders active in the dialogue and ensuring that the values and the behaviors that are representative, that they represent and that they model is taught. People have to be taught how to model the way through inclusive leadership. Finally, you got to brace people for a continuous process and committing to that continuous improvement. Someone said earlier in the chat room, they said, this isn't a once and done process. It is definitely a continuous. You've got to make the case for that with your leadership team. And the statistics around change management and how we people don't really like to change are all the statistics you need. And so it's a long-term game, not a short-term. So what does that mean? Right size solutions at the right time. Too much and you're going to overwhelm your employees. Too many unconscious bias conversations or social injustice conversations, and you're going to overwhelm your white majority. And too little, and you're going to alienate your non-majority folks, right? So you want to be able to support change, right, with mentoring and micro consulting and coaching and training and train the trainer and facilitated discussion circles in a way that is what we call a minimum effective dose. And that is just responding to what you've identified, right? That continuous process. What have you identified? Go to the next slide there, Vivek. There you go. What have you identified and how do we resolve it? How do we ensure that the manner in which we're going to resolve this resonates with the employees? And then providing just the right amount of coaching to begin to shift the culture. And that part is iterative. This framework we're talking about, you're looking at probably assessing your culture no less. And I'm not talking about a big engagement survey. I'm talking about the either network analysis or a targeted engagement assessment. Anywhere from at least once every 6 months, certainly once a year, but you're not going to really create the kind of shifts you need to in once a year. So I would recommend at least once every 6 months. We do have some organizations that are doing the verbal conversations once every 3 months, once every quarter, something like that. But if you use technology, then it can be an ongoing process, and that's pretty important. So where does that stand now? So this means that you've listened to your employees who are most impacted by D&I issues. You've increased the awareness on the biases present in the organization and how they play out, from recruiting to development to opportunities to pay equity, etc. And now you're providing targeted development for your people leaders, empowering them with the information they need to make the right to take the right actions and make the right decisions at the right time. So to recap, this framework you're going to take into whatever initiative you have on your table in front of you. If you're wanting to implement listening circles, I would recommend you use this process first. If you're wanting to implement or overhaul your recruiting methods, you want to take this process, identify, engage, and solve, so that you have this continuous cultural transformation and you're using both active learning principles as well as best practices in change management in order to ensure you're really meeting your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. So the holistic approach for D&I, we've talked a lot about continuous improvement. We've talked a lot about making sure that it's people driven and people focused, not top down, but you're also top down support, but also crowdsourcing those solutions. Targeted and customized will allow your those who are in charge of identifying the budget to understand that you're not asking to boil the ocean all in one fell swoop, but you're targeting just the needs at the moment over a longer period of time. Supporting your operational leaders, making sure they have the language, making sure they understand sensitivity, and doing that with either micro consulting or micro coaching when you've got a people leader that really doesn't understand the need for sensitivity or the need to change how they speak to women, et cetera. And then larger trainings when you've got a culture that needs to adopt greater awareness. When you're looking to create a culture shift, you're going to have measurable ROI. So you want to look at the metrics and what you can track. That looks like, ultimately, in an ideal progressive company, it looks like pay equity, but it also looks like diversity and gender representation. If you're in a part of your geography and is 20% Asian, then at the different levels, you want to look and see, well, are the different levels, including our executive and our board, representative of the community that we serve? And that goes for all the above. What are the percentage of the various groups in the community that we serve, and do we mirror those groups? And how exactly are we impacting the community by walking our talk and supporting the various diverse groups and communities that we serve? Finally, it's about long-term impact, and we've said it a number of times, the long game, being patient as you see this through with the right-sized approach and continuous learning, and you can shift the culture. So we had a couple of questions that I want to go back to. Vivek, why don't we turn off, we've got a few minutes, why don't we turn off the PowerPoint there, and we're just would love to take a moment to answer your questions. Shweta, you had one here from Fernan, right?
Yes. Yeah, and the question was directed to you. Do you believe that there should be an intentional intersection between CSR, corporate social responsibility, and DEI strategy? It seems to me that they should not be mutually exclusive.
You are so telling the truth. You know, what's interesting about intersection of D&I and CSR is we've only really seen that dialogue come to the surface over maybe the last 5 years. It's interesting. It should have been there all along. And for some companies, it is. But we're really seeing more organizations acknowledge that CSR, corporate social responsibility, matters. It matters to their employees. It matters to their brand. It matters to their recruiting efforts. And I think it was just about 2 years ago, McKinsey did a study and found that about 80% of companies said that they consider equity when addressing their CSR, their D&I efforts inside their corporate social responsibility agreements, commitments. But only 1 out of 4 of those very same companies say that they're actually moving in that direction. So that was just a couple of years ago. So I think that what's really important, though, for you folks that are in D&I is to recognize that just the shift to include it more inclusively in corporate social responsibility policies and commitments and strategic priorities is about to be the norm and cannot be separated. You cannot have a social responsibility policy without a commitment to diversity and inclusion. And some companies are just now catching their snap about it, which means the application of that may take a little bit of time to catch up. Is that fair? Is that y'all's experience, Vivek, Shweta?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the trend we've been seeing as well. I mean, it needs to be. I know from the metric standpoint, from the metrics that are measured for CSI from the FASB, they're often they tend to be very kind of a lot of other metrics, but D&I is just one of them. So it's there, it's just never highlighted or talked in the same kind of sense. But we're starting to see that changing, which is promising, but we do need to have companies make more and more of an effort. And that starts with measuring. I think what happens here is this is just so immeasurable that that's why it kind of gets sidelined. So the more that we can start to measure it and come up with metrics and really start to highlight that, that's how you kind of push that conversation. And you also start to, when you put numbers in front of people, when you start to trend it and you put a trend line next to people, it forces them to react and to just have an opinion. And that's what we need with diversity and inclusion.
Well said. That's exactly right. You know, one of the things that Vernon also said a little bit earlier was that how many companies fall into that pitfall that, you know, training doesn't create systemic change. And but training combined with either micro consulting, mentoring, and coaching literally increases the learning retention and the adoption of those principles fourfold. So I think the numbers are training alone has somewhere between a 17 and a 22% retention rate, which basically means 17 cents. Don't tell people 17 cents on every training dollar spent is all of the ROI you're going to get out of it. But when you combine that with coaching, it improves fourfold to 80, 82%, 88%, something like that. So pretty impressive. So I really want to respect everyone. We want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for being here. Something really special that we've created here recently is complimentary, and we're calling it our diversity and inclusion benchmark. And Vivek, can you take people, show on the screen. So our diversity, equity, inclusion benchmark is a way for you to take may take you 10, 15 minutes max. You answer a few questions and it will share with you where your organization falls in comparison with other organizations. Are you as progressive as you think? Or are you just getting started but need a little help on, okay, there's a lot of things I could do, where do I begin? Yeah. At the end of taking this benchmark, you're going to get a report and it will share with you, okay, where do I need to start? So I highly encourage you. Vivek sent that link. It's leandei.com/DEI benchmark. And take that. And at the end of it, you'll have an opportunity to schedule a complimentary consultation, which is the other piece that we love to have an opportunity to do. Is even if what we're doing isn't a good fit for you, when each of us have a passion for this work, and when we say we are happy to help, we would welcome the opportunity to support you. We really mean it. And so, Vivek, will you show folks our contact information and how they can get a hold of us?
Yep. And the question on metrics, which I think we got a couple others, but the metrics, we have a lot of metrics and we can share. I mean, let's talk more. I mean, with the identify, there are a lot of different metrics that we can come up with. We can also, there are metrics along the training, the coaching, the micro consulting, as well as, of course, with the chatbot and the engage phase of this. So lots of metrics that we can talk about. Please reach out and we're happy to share that info.
Yeah, and that goes from, representation to pay equity, to feelings of inclusion, to engagement level, to even using the metrics of what really great organizations are doing. There's ways to compare your initiatives to those. So we're happy to share that. Please reach out to us at consult@leandei.com or visit our website, take that DEI benchmark, and let's schedule a strategy session.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.